is about to bring you into a good land. Make sure you don't forget God, your God.
Welcome back to Teaching Through the Bible, as we today conclude the book of Deuteronomy, but not just the book of Deuteronomy, this entire section up here, first section of the Bible, the books of the law, the Torah, that give us an understanding of how Yahweh God makes a covenant with his people. Well, in the book of Deuteronomy, we're in the last few chapters 31 through 34. And when we look at these chapters, what do we see? Well, we've seen throughout this whole book, what's the theme? Covenant renewal. This is a covenant that was established on Mount Sinai back in Exodus, and we're getting an expansion. We're getting to see more details of what this covenant will be like. And in fact, the whole book of Deuteronomy, up to this point, this has all been showing us stuff that's organized in a way that would be very typical of a second millennium BC covenant treaty. And here we had the preamble, right? That is Yahweh saying who he is, the historical prologue, what he's already done for his people. The 10 words, often called the 10 Commandments, this is in chapter 5, and then all the way up through chapter 26, we're seeing it fleshed out, taking commands and saying, here's more details to that. Finally, we saw the potential curses or blessings, depending on how they did or did not follow those commands. And then ritual, ceremony that they performed regarding the covenant. Well, lastly, we get to the witnesses. We get to the death of the mediator, these last two sections here for chapters 31 to 34. So if you flip with me to Deuteronomy, starting in chapter 31, we'll be going through these last few chapters here. So what we see here is a number of things. First of all, we can note something that if you're more familiar with the Bible, you may have heard this phrase, be strong and courageous. And if you have, where is that from? A lot of people may say, oh, beginning of the book of Joshua, which starts out the prophet section, this middle section right here that we'll get to in the next class. But that's not actually where it initially comes from. It's actually building upon what we see at the end of Deuteronomy here. So if you go to chapter 31, go to verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, verse 23. What do we see here? Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread. That's verse 6. Verse 7, be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that Yahweh has sworn to their fathers to give them. Verse 8, do not fear or be dismayed. And verse 23, be strong and courageous, for you shall bring the people of Israel into the land that I swore to give them. I will be with you. This is all encouragement to Joshua from Yahweh. Sometimes some of these are through what Moses is saying, but this is all from Yahweh to Joshua as he is commissioned to be the new mediator of this covenant here. So you need a covenant mediator. You need that go-between that can be the person between Yahweh, between his people. And it's been Moses. But Moses cannot go to the promised land. Moses is going to die. And so now we have this very critical new covenant mediator, Joshua, who is commanded, do not be afraid, do not be terrified, be courageous. All of this that we're going to see at the beginning of the book of Joshua, it actually is all grounded in Deuteronomy, right here in chapter 31. So knowing these books of the law, I said last time, this is all the foundation that will build up the rest of what we see, and everything will make more sense in the rest of the Old Testament, and in fact the rest of the Bible, if we know these first 5 books. Here's another example right here. And then we get to the witnesses. So you have witnesses in a covenant agreement. Well, the witnesses here are literally heaven and earth, it says. It says that a few times, actually, that God is calling heaven and earth as witnesses for this covenant. And he says that several times, including in a song that they're given, which is itself another witness of sorts. So in the song that God gives Moses to give to the people in chapter 32, this song is basically saying, here's what is happening and what is going to happen. It actually kind of prophesies what's going to happen, which is that the Israelites, they are going to abandon Yahweh, the true God, and they're going to worship false gods, and they're not going to listen to Yahweh. And then there's going to be consequences. Like we saw last time, there's curses that will come from that. And all of this is going to happen, and it's going to be because they're not following Yahweh. And so this song preemptively is saying, here's what will happen. So when it does happen, they already know this song, and they have that in their minds already, and they know that's why this happened. They may not want to admit it, they may not want to do anything about it, but they really know because they've already been told this. This song will witness against them. This song will be there to say, you know what you did, it's not the right thing, and that's why all this is happening that is happening. All the curses that come, here's why. And then lastly, we have another witness, which is actually the Bible, believe it or not. So, in chapter 31, it says that these words are going to be written down. At the end of chapter 31, it talks about Moses writing down all these words, and they will be a witness. They will testify against these people. So all these words, that including the blessings and curses. Hey, here's all the commands. Here's what you should be doing, should not be doing. Here's the blessings if you follow. Here's the curses if you don't. And these words are going to be written down, and they're called the Torah, which means the law. And when they're written down, they act as a witness against the people when they violate the covenant. And so, that being written down, that's the Bible they had. They didn't have a complete Bible. They didn't have all the rest of these books that will be coming later, because at that time they only had Genesis through Deuteronomy, but they will have that. They will have that part of the Bible. They will have God's Word in that first section there. And so, not as much as we've got now, but still God's inspired Word. They'll have the first 5 books as a witness against them when they violate God's commands. So we've had this new mediator that is put in place, that's commissioned by Yahweh. We have these witnesses that will testify against the people when they do wrong, when they do evil, and when God judges them for that. And as we look at the next chapter, 33, we get something that's, again, doing a kind of a prophecy, just like we saw with the song in chapter 32. It's saying what's going to happen in the future. And it may look, if you flip to chapter 33, you may look at this, you read through this, and say, something seems similar here. We read 33 and 34. Why does this ring a bell? It's something that would maybe be akin to how I used to play this Nintendo Switch a good bit, but enough to where my daughters knew this was the Nintendo Switch. But then I stopped playing that when I got the Nintendo Switch 2. And for all purposes, to my daughters, it's the same thing. They're very similar. They do the same thing, play the same games. They detach, both of them. They're really Switch and Switch 2. You know, even the name of it, it's very similar. There's a pattern there that you can detect, how the buttons are, everything about it. You can see a lot of similarities. Well, if you go back to the end of Genesis, we see in the last couple of chapters of Genesis, we have Jacob, who is the patriarch, who is the leader of his family, and he prophesies about his sons, who are the ones who become the names of the 12 tribes. They are the leaders, the heads of the 12 tribes, once they have kids who have kids, and so on and so forth. So if you go back and look at the end of Genesis, you will see this guy prophesying about the 12 tribes. And then he dies. And you have the death of that prophet. Jacob dies. And at the very end, Joseph asks that his body be kept and eventually brought back to the promised land because he knows God is going to bring them back there one day. So you have a promise that they're going back to that land. Well, what do we have here? The same thing. We have Moses, who is leading God's people. Moses, who is leading the Israelites. And what's 33 start with? This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the people of Israel before his death. It's the same kind of thing. It's a blessing that is a prophecy, just like what Jacob did for the 12 tribes. And what happens right after this? Chapter 34, Moses dies. But there's also going to be a promise of the land in those last few verses. And we'll read about those in just a second, verses 9 through 12, the very last verses of Deuteronomy. But so we see this kind of pattern. We see what happened at the end of Genesis, now is happening at the end of Deuteronomy. Like an intentional parallel there. Now, when we go through these tribes, though, what is it we always should do when we see a list of tribes? Let's look at which tribes are there, because there's always 12 tribes. The names aren't always the same, though. As I said last time, sometimes you have Joseph and you have Levi. Sometimes Levi's taken out. Joseph split into two with Ephraim and Manasseh. Sometimes they're done other ways. But which 12 tribes are mentioned and what order? Well, here I'll just make one observation, one example that shows potentially significance here, is there's actually, Joseph is just one. Ephraim and Manasseh is combined as one. And you also have Levi there, so you're thinking, okay, so I know which 12 is going to be. But then, Shimeon's not there. He's not here anywhere. There's only 11 named. Why would there only be 11? Because you generally have 12, right? It's the 12 tribes. Why is there only 11? Where's Shimeon? Perhaps is this part of the prophecy? The fact that he didn't mention Shimeon. Because what happens to Shimeon? Well, essentially, Shimeon gets land inside of Judah and gets absorbed into Judah. So like if you go look at a map, you will see something like, if this is Judah's area here, and then you've got the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea. If you got Judah here, then those people will just kind of do this little dotted circle thing that represents Shimeon within Judah. And Shimeon is kind of absorbed into that. So, in a sense, Shimeon does disappear. And here, in this blessing that Moses gives to Israel, in this prophecy of what is going to come of these tribes, Shimeon disappears. So, perhaps this is a foreshadowing of that, and part of the prophecy in and of itself, the fact that it's not just a different list of 12. There's only 11. So he's obviously missing. It's a blank space. If you had a list of 12 names you're supposed to put there, there's different 12 names sometimes, but there's usually 12. And so there's only 11. One is missing. That's Shimeon. So just something that you can observe here, and there can be other things that you notice as far as maybe if you look at what's the order, things like that. It's always great to look at those 12 whenever they list the 12 tribes of Israel. But as we move on to the last verses, I mentioned earlier that there's a promise of a land, and we'll read these last few verses that talk to Joshua, talk about him, and talk about Moses. Verse 9, and Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him, and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. And so right here, you have this new leader who's going to lead them into the promised land. It's mentioned in chapters 32 with the song, chapter 33 with the blessing. They're getting prepared. They've now got their guy that's going to lead them into that promised land. And that's where we'll pick up in the next class that begins with the book of Joshua. But notice here that it says, there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses. But what else did Deuteronomy tell us? If you recall, chapter 18, verse 15, Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. That's Moses speaking. He will raise up someone like me. And then in chapter 34, this is presumably a note added afterwards, right? Moses is dead, so he probably didn't write this. This last chapter that's added on to complete Deuteronomy, and it says, there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses. So whenever this was written, they're saying, hey, Moses is gone, but there's not anyone like him. Joshua was a great guy. We'll see that when we read the book. But he wasn't at the level of Moses. And yet there is going to be one like Moses. There is going to be someone. How is that? This is pointing us, of course, to Jesus. Jesus, who in the Gospels, when you read the Gospels in the New Testament, just like the law shows us God establishing the old covenant with his people who took the form of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, well, he's going to inaugurate a new covenant with a new mediator, a greater mediator, Jesus. He's going to inaugurate that new covenant with his people who, in the New Testament, take the form of the church. And so this new covenant and this new mediator, greater than Moses, this is pointed forward to here when we read the very end here. There hasn't been this person. When is this person coming? And this is a question that the Israelites had throughout the Old Testament. Where's this new Moses? And in the Gospels, he shows up. One greater than Moses, one who is more powerful than Moses, who has greater wonders and works than Moses, who leads his people to a new and better covenant than the one Moses could, and to a new and better promised land than the one that Moses brought his people to. So, that wraps it up. This is it. Thank you for coming to the end of the class with me, and I really hope you have learned a lot through this. I hope we can continue to as we look through these next sections of the Bible. Next time, the section on the book, the section's called the Prophets. That section is covenant history. We're going to see, all right, well, they've got the covenant. So how do they respond to that? What does it look like for them to respond to the covenant that God has made in these first 5 books? We'll see that in the prophets. That's going to be Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12. Now, that's not the order that you see in your English Bibles, but we will discuss that when we get into the intro for that next class, and I'll see you then. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.